The movie starts with a speech by Frank Costello, who's talking about the good old days in Boston. During the speech, we see footage of rioting in the streets. Costello basically tells us that he has no interest taking a back seat in life. He wants to be the driver, and he wants to control everything that happens to him. We see Frank go into a diner or malt shop where he shakes down the owner for protection money, which tells us that Frank is a mobster of some kind. He also compliments the guy on his pretty teenage daughter and calls the girl over. When she comes, he makes a rude sexual comment to her. Frank notices that a young kid down the counter is looking at him. He asks the kid if he belongs to Johnny Sullivan, and the kid nods, since he is Colin Sullivan. Frank knows that the kid's dad is dead, so he buys the kid a ton of groceries and comic books, then tells him that if he ever wants to earn some extra money, he should come see him. We see the young kid working as an altar boy. Then we flash to Frank telling him not to obey what the church says, because the church likes to give out orders. Frank says you need to make your own orders, and we cut to some footage of him killing a MAFIA guy and his girlfriend because, apparently, the MAFIA tried to move in on his turf. Years into the future, we see Colin Sullivan going through police academy and working toward being a cop. Meanwhile, we see another guy named Billy Costigan taking the final police exam. Next thing you know, Colin and Billy are both graduating. Frank Costello drives by to say hi to Colin and to give him a present. It looks like Colin is now a mole cop working for the mob. Next, we see Colin in the Office of Special Investigations, which is led by Captain Queenan and Sergeant Dignam. Queenan seems like a nice enough guy, but Dignam is a real jerk. Right after Colin leaves, Billy Costigan gets up and heads into the office. We find out in his interview that his family connections are all in the rough neighborhood of Southie, which just happens to be where Frank Costello does all his mobbing. Billy also has an uncle who was killed for being involved in organized crime. Another uncle named Tommy was busted for selling guns. Sergeant Dignam is more than skeptical about Billy's background. Meanwhile, we see Colin get promoted to staff sergeant immediately, and he sits in on a special meeting for the police department's best and brightest. This is a special unit working to mess with organized crime in Boston, in cooperation with the FBI. The leader of the meeting is Captain Ellaby, who shows us a picture of Billy Costigan's uncle Jackie after he was shot and killed. He also shows some pics of other organized crime big shots and ends with a picture of Frank Costello. Back in Special Investigations, Queenan and Dignam tell Billy that he'll never be a state trooper. They think his SAT marks are way too high and that he's just not cut out for the job. Meanwhile, we see Billy at his mother's bedside as she dies of cancer. Along the way, he cuts ties with the upper-class part of his family. Billy is back in the Special Investigations unit with Queenan and Dignam. It looks like they want Billy to become an undercover cop and infiltrate the organized crime ring in his old neighborhood of Southie. The big catch is that the cops can't conceal the fact that Billy was a police trainee, so they'll have to give him back his street cred by convicting him of a crime and sending him to jail. Then he'll eventually get out on probation and see a court-ordered psychiatrist to convince everyone he's a legit gangster. Next thing we know, we see Billy Costigan back out of jail and pulling off drug deals with his cousin in Southie. His cousin mentions the fact that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing so close to Frank Costello's turf. Billy hangs out in a rough bar while his cousin Sean tries to introduce him to Frank Costello's people. These guys remember Billy's uncle Jackie well. Meanwhile, Billy orders a cranberry juice at the bar and another guy talks smack to him. So Billy breaks a glass ashtray against his head and tries to hit him, but he's pulled away by Mr. French, Frank Costello's right-hand man, before he can inflict the damage. French lays down the law and tells Billy that there are some people he can hit and some he can't, like people who are connected to the mob. He also tells Billy that he'll have to stop making drug deals with his cousin. The only reason French isn't messing Billy up already is that French knows Billy's family well and likes them. Billy agrees to let go of the drug deals, and Mr. French orders him a new cranberry juice. French gives the smack talker at the bar a few more punches before leaving. In a staff meeting at the police station, Captain Ellaby and Sergeant Dignam describe how Frank Costello organized a heist of microprocessors that he apparently plans on selling to the Chinese. The cops want to create a sting operation to take Costello down once and for all. The FBI wants to know if Dignam's unit has anyone undercover with Costello at the moment, but Dignam won't give a straight answer because he wants to protect his informants. Back at some corner store, Billy is having lunch while two Italian guys try to shake down the store owner for money. Billy walks over to the register and tries to make small talk with the Italians. Then he loses it on them and beats them both to a pulp, breaking his hand in the process. In a restaurant, Colin is on a date with Madeline, who works as a psychiatrist in police station. Colin wants to know how messy Madeline's job gets, with all the feelings people pour out in her office. He also gets a second date with her by knowing the answer to a trivia question about what Sigmund Freud said about the Irish. Now we're back in the Southie bar with Billy drinking a cranberry juice. The place falls silent as Frank Costello walks in and sits down beside him. Costello asks Billy if he knows who he is, but Billy pretends not to know. Costello then implies that he is the dude who runs the Southie neighborhood. Frank polishes off a shot and tells Billy to come with him to a back room. As they go back, Frank explains how the Mafia keeps trying to hone in on his territory. He says he's sick of it. Frank also explains that the two guys Billy beat up in the convenience store are Mafia dudes who will soon come back to Southie and kill Billy. So Frank asks Billy if he wants Frank to stop them. Billy asks if this is something he can handle personally, which just draws a bemused look from Frank and Mr. French. It's clear to us that Billy is playing dumb, but Frank and French seem to think that he really doesn't understand how beating up two Mafia guys might be a big deal. While Mr. French searches Billy, Frank mentions that he knew Billy's father. He says that the old man could have been a real somebody, but he was too stubborn about living an honest, crime-free life. At this point, Costello has Mr. French break the cast off of Billy's arm, and then Costello starts wailing on the arm with Billy's boot while asking him if he's still in the police force. Billy denies it until Frank is satisfied. Then Frank throws a bunch of cash at Billy and tells him to go get his hand checked out again. Next thing you know, we see Colin investigating the murder of two Mafia guys from Providence. They just so happen to be the two guys Billy beat up in the corner store, so chances are that this is the work of Frank Costello. We also notice that Billy is now hanging out in Frank's place, which suggests that Frank is bringing him in on some business. Frank sits Billy down and gives him a little inspirational speech while he pulls the ring from a severed hand as if it's no big deal. At this point, we notice that Captain Queenan and Sergeant Dignam are listening in. After seeing the severed hand, Billy goes into the bathroom and ditches his wire. From now on, he says he'll only communicate with Queenan by phone. He also wants to know what he's doing all of this for, and Queenan lets him in on the fact that Costello plans on selling microprocessors to the Chinese. Colin becomes the leader of a special unit, and he handpicks his own team. Back at the station, Colin says that he has created this new unit because he thinks that Frank Costello has a rat in the state police. This is pretty clever, since Colin is the rat. Frank Costello gives Billy a cell phone and gives him instructions on how to use it. Then at lunch, he pulls a 180 and says that Billy's father and uncle would kill him if they were alive to see him sitting with Billy. He asks Billy if he's ever thought about going back to school. It genuinely seems as if Frank wants what's best for Billy. For the first time, we see Billy sitting in Madeline's office and talking to her about his feelings. It looks like she's his court-appointed counselor. Billy tries to explain how hard it is to work beside a mass murderer all day. Back in his apartment, Billy takes a handful of OxyContin pills, which means he's probably drugging himself pretty heavily to stay calm while doing jobs for Costello. It's been a year since Billy went undercover, and he's had enough. He's clearly burnt out. He wants to know why Queenan and Dignam haven't made a move on Costello yet, since Billy can connect him to dozens of felonies, but Queenan and Dignam say they're still building a case. They also mention that they think Costello has a spy inside the Special Investigations Unit, which only freaks Billy out even more. Back in Madeline's office, Billy says he wants Madeline to give him Valium to help him sleep because he's going nuts with insomnia, but Madeline is skeptical. She thinks he's using her to get drugs. After Billy storms out, Madeline runs after him to give him a prescription and tell him she's transferring him to another counselor. Things calm down between the two of them, and Billy asks her out for a cup of coffee. Colin walks into a police safe house while a huge crew of people is getting ready for a sting on Frank Costello. Apparently, this is the night Costello is going to sell microprocessors to the Chinese. Colin makes time to call Frank and give him a heads up. He also knows for sure now that there's a rat somewhere in Frank's operation. As the sting starts up, Colin learns that the FBI is monitoring all cell phone calls, so he uses texting in his pocket to tell Frank to have all his men turn off their phones. Inside a dock building, Frank and his crew get down to dealing their microprocessors. Meanwhile, Billy texts a dollar symbol to Queenan to let him know that the money for the deal is on site. In a surprise move, Costello's crew and the Chinese gang leave the building on boats and head out into the harbor. When the cops realize this, Captain Ellaby punches one of the camera guys in the face for not putting up enough surveillance. It looks like the cops just lost their best chance at getting Costello. Billy works a job to kill a guy who crossed Costello, but during the job, the guy lets slip that Costello is actually a protected FBI informant. The whole reason he's never been caught is because he keeps selling out other gangsters. Billy meets with Queenan at night and tells him that Costello Costello is a protected FBI informant. Billy walks into a warehouse one day and finds Mr. French waiting for him. French wants him to write down every scrap of personal information about himself. Billy writes down his stuff and helps another thug named Fitzy write the word citizens on the envelope that they're putting all their info in. Then he leaves and tells the guys he doesn't care if Frank ordered everyone to stick around. Next time we see Billy, he shows up at Madeline's apartment. She lets him in, and after some chit-chat about Billy's vulnerability, they end up sleeping together. We see Billy tailing Frank Costello. Costello has the envelope with citizens written on it, and Billy hopes to find the police rat by seeing who Costello gives the envelope to. Costello meets Colin in a theater and gives him the envelope. Billy watches the conversation, but he can't see Colin's face beneath the ball cap he's wearing. When Colin leaves the theater, Billy chases him to get a better look at his face. Just when Billy's about to get to him, though, his phone goes off, and Colin ducks behind a truck. The text to Billy tells him to arrest the guy he's following, so Billy pulls out his gun and goes after him, but Colin escapes. Back at the station, Colin checks the street's security cameras to see if he can make an ID on whoever was chasing him. The camera is too blurry for him to do it, though. We notice at this point that he has also brought the citizen's envelope with him to work. Colin decides to find Costello's rat once and for all by putting surveillance on Captain Queenan and waiting for Queenan to lead him to the rat. Queenan takes subway, where Billy calls him and gives him the address for meeting. The guy tailing Queenan reports back to Colin that Queenan is meeting the rat, so Colin calls Costello to tell him the address where the rat is meeting Queenan. Back on the rooftop of a building, Queenan tells Billy that he's going to start the process of pulling him out of his undercover job. Suddenly, Billy gets a call from Delahunt saying that the rat is meeting with Queenan on Washington Street, but Delahunt gives him the wrong address, saying 314 instead of 344. Billy Queenan that they have to get out of there immediately. Queenan stays to create a diversion while Billy takes the fire escape out of the building. Billy tries to walk away from the building, but Queenan lands and dies right in front of him. Costello's men chucked him out a window. Meanwhile, the cops following Queenan get into a shootout. One of them shoots Delahunt right through the gut. At the police station, Sergeant Dignam and Captain Ellaby question Colin about why he had Queenan followed, but Colin avoids the question by saying that he was acting on secret information. Dignam isn't impressed with his captain getting killed, so he punches Colin in the face. Captain Ellaby tells Dignam to take a leave of absence, but Dignam quits his job instead. Colin wants access to Queenan's files, but the only guy who can get them is Dignam, and he's gone now. Back at Costello's safe house, Fitzy questions Billy on where he was when the gang was trying to reach him. Billy makes up a story about being at the grocery store, but he gets called over by a dying Delahunt who got shot through the gut. Delahunt tells Billy that he knows he's the rat because he gave him the wrong address, and yet Billy showed up at the right one. But Delahunt dies before he can tell anyone else. Back at the station, Colin picks up Queenan's phone and calls the last number Queenan called. Billy picks up but doesn't say a word, and neither does Colin. They just listen to the silence for something like 10 seconds before Billy hangs up and starts packing his stuff to leave. A minute later, Billy calls Colin back, and Colin explains that he is Sergeant Sullivan and that he's taking over Queenan's unit. Colin wants to meet with Billy, but as you might expect, Billy doesn't trust anyone. He demands to speak to Dignam, but Colin tells him that Dignam is on a leave of absence. Colin says he wants Billy to come in, but Billy hangs up. As he goes through Queenan's things, Colin realizes that Costello is an FBI informant. Next thing you know, Costello and his boys are on their way to a major deal. Colin calls him up to tell him that he's got a tail. Costello tells Colin to get rid of the tail, which Colin says he'll do, but he doesn't. Turns out that Colin's pretty mad about Costello being an FBI informant without telling him. Billy keeps texting info to Colin, who directs the police to the drug deal that Costello is doing. The cops creep in on the site of the drug scene until a huge firefight breaks out. Costello and French try to drive away, but they're surrounded. French gets shot through the neck and drives away as Costello makes a break for it. In some part of a warehouse, Costello runs into Colin and asks him what happened. Colin tells Frank he sold him out because he was an FBI informant, but Costello tells Colin that he never gave up anyone who wasn't already going down. He's been playing the FBI for fools, and he sure as sugar never would have given up Colin. Frank says Colin was always like a son to him, but Colin accuses him of wanting a son because he's unable to have kids himself. This sets off Frank's temper, and he tries to shoot Colin, but Colin is quicker on the draw, and he kills Costello. Back at the police station, Colin returns to a hero's welcome. He heads into his office to sit down with Billy Costigan and give him his life back. Billy also wants to know what Colin is going to do about Costello's rat. Colin swears he'll arrest the guy. Billy says he wants his money, and he wants to go home. He gives Colin the password for his file, and Colin heads out to access it. Once Colin's gone, though, Billy sees the envelope that says citizens on it sitting in Colin's office, so he knows that Colin is the rat, and he takes off without a trace. Once Colin gets back to his office, he realizes what Billy saw and heads off to erase his police files. Now it doesn't matter what Billy knows about him, because because there are no records of Billy in the police database. Billy tracks down Madeline and hands her an envelope. Then he tells her to open it if anything ever happens to him, because he doesn't know who else to give it to. Back at her apartment, Madeline hands Colin an ultrasound picture and says that they're going to have a baby boy. When she heads back into the kitchen, Madeline goes through the mail and sees an envelope for Colin with a return address of W.W. Costigan. She gets suspicious and opens it to find a CD. She plays the CD with headphones on and listens to tapped conversations between Frank Costello and Colin. It turns out that Frank was so paranoid that he taped all of his conversations with people, so Madeline hears everything about Colin's world of lies. Billy calls Colin and tells him that Costello's lawyer came to him with everything. It turns out that in the end, Costello trusted Billy more than anyone. Billy sets up a meeting with Colin at the building where Queenan died. When Colin arrives, Billy pulls a gun on him and tells him he's taking him back to the police station to arrest him. But Colin tells him he can't do that because his file is gone and nobody in the world knows he's a cop anymore. Billy says he doesn't care if the charges don't stick because he's arresting Colin. At this point, another police officer arrives and pulls his gun, ordering Billy to step away from Colin. Billy tries to explain that Colin is Costello's rat. He and the other cop recognize each other from police academy, but the other cop still can't allow Billy to leave with Colin. Billy slowly backs away until he and Colin are in an elevator heading to the first floor while the other cop takes the stairs. The elevator doors open and Billy gets shot through the head and killed by another cop from Colin's squad. Then the other cop from the roof comes out of the stairwell and he gets shot as well. He tells Colin that Costello had two different cops working in the police force all along. As soon as Colin gets his hands on a gun, he shoots this new guy in the head. A police cleanup crew arrives and Colin gives his account of how Billy Costigan and the other officers all died. He mentions that Billy was an undercover cop, so Billy ends up getting a state funeral. Madeline goes to the funeral and cries for Billy. Then she stares at Colin with accusing eyes and walks past him without a word when the funeral is over. Colin heads back to his apartment alone and finds Dignam inside wearing plastic on his feet and all over his body. Dignam shoots Colin through the head, avenging for the death of Queenan and Billy. Then he walks away without a trace. In the final shot of the movie, we get a look at the balcony railing outside Colin's apartment and a rat walking on it, symbolizing Colin Sullivan's disloyalty.